On August 7, 1942, as U.S. Marines launch a surprise amphibious assault on Guadalcanal, the strategic linchpin of Japan's Pacific defenses, a team of Imperial Japanese radio operators, intercepting the first frantic and overwhelmed reports, are among the few who truly grasped the irreversible scale of the unfolding disaster. Through the static and desperate pleas for aid, they silently confront an unheeded truth. This isn't merely a battle lost, but the definitive beginning of the end for their empire's dominion in the Pacific. The air in the Rabaul radio intelligence bunker hung heavy, a palpable presence composed of tropical humidity, the metallic tang of ozone from the banks of receivers, and the faint, ever-present scent of sweat and stale tea. Pre-dawn on August 7, 1942, was a time usually marked by a tranquil monotony, a rhythm of routine intercepts, and the hushed professionalism of men devoted to the silent war of signals. The vacuum tubes, arrayed in countless rows, cast an amber, almost sickly glow across the faces of the operators, their light struggling against the oppressive tropical darkness that pressed in from outside the reinforced concrete walls. The deep resonant hum of the generators, a constant vibration that permeated the very foundations of the bunker, provided the only truly consistent sound, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the static and distant chatter of the Pacific theater. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, a man whose features were as etched with experience as the circuits he meticulously maintained, adjusted the well-worn leather cups of his headphones. His fingers, calloused from years of fine-tuning equipment and endless transcription, moved with an almost unconscious precision over the dials. He glanced at the chronometer, its stark black numbers a rigid counterpoint to the fluidity of time in the tropics. 0547 hours. The night shift was nearing its end, and a faint, almost imperceptible shift in atmospheric pressure, a change that only an attuned ear like Tanaka's could detect, hinted at unusually clear reception from the distant Solomon Islands chain. He trusted these subtle omens, these whispers of the air, far more than the bombastic pronouncements of official communiques. He had seen too much, heard too many hollow victories in the static, to be anything but wary. Beside him, Private Isamu Kobayashi stirred, a restless energy in his young frame. He stretched, a deep, satisfied yawn escaping his lips, his early 20s still brimming with an unshakable optimism. 6 months in the sweltering subterranean world of the bunker had done little to dampen his youthful zeal for the Emperor's cause. Indeed, he found solace, even inspiration, in the company of men like Tanaka, his eagerness to contribute often manifesting in bright, patriotic pronouncements. He was an embodiment of the prevailing sentiment, a fresh canvas eager to be painted with the vibrant colors of imperial glory. "Tanaka-san," Kobayashi whispered, his voice hushed, careful not to disturb the focused concentration of the other operators dotting the vast, dimly lit room. "Do you truly believe the Americans are capable of any significant action in this sector? The newspapers, even the official broadcasts, speak only of their continued retreat, their forces shattered and morale broken after our swift advance through the islands. Surely their focus remains on Europe, as our strategists predict?" Tanaka offered a non-committal grunt, a sound that conveyed neither agreement nor dissent, merely acknowledgement of the younger man's presence. His focus, however, remained riveted to the faint, almost ghostly signal bleeding through the static on the 4.2 megahertz band. It was elusive, fragmented, but insistent. Something about its unique modulation, its erratic pattern, prickled at the edges of his consciousness. It felt wrong. It was a deviation from the expected, a discordant note in the symphony of the usual Pacific chatter. He couldn't yet pinpoint the source, couldn't quite resolve the garbled fragments into coherent meaning, but the anomaly itself was a warning. He had long since learned that the most crucial messages were often the ones that arrived veiled, disguised by interference, their urgency betrayed only by the subtle shifts in the electromagnetic current. Captain Masao Sato, a man whose very posture exuded the rigid discipline of a career officer, emerged from the antechamber that served as his private office. A steaming mug of tea, a rare luxury in the bunker's perpetually muggy atmosphere, rested in his hand. He surveyed his command with a proprietary gaze, his eyes sweeping across the rows of diligent operators, the glowing dials, the silent, purposeful movements. At 44, Sato carried the weight of his rank with an almost ceremonial grace, His reputation built not just on his technical acumen, but on an unyielding adherence to protocol and an unquestioning loyalty to the official narrative of Imperial success. The Rabaul intelligence station was more than just a posting. It was the zenith of his professional aspirations, a vital node in the Empire's sprawling, intricate communications network, a testament to Japan's technological and strategic superiority. "Gentlemen," Sato announced, his voice a low, controlled baritone that carried just enough authority to cut through the hum of the machinery without startling the operators. "Word has arrived from Admiral Yamamoto's staff. They express a particular interest in any unusual Allied activity, however minor, originating from the Southern Solomons. I expect heightened vigilance from all shifts for the next 72 hours. No detail, however insignificant it may seem, is to be overlooked." Kobayashi, ever eager, straightened his back, his shoulders squared with renewed purpose. "Sir, if I may inquire, what are we to anticipate? Should we increase our sweeps for reconnaissance flights, or perhaps prepare for another of the enemy's desperate, though ultimately futile, raids, as we saw near Port Moresby?" His voice was tinged with a youthful eagerness to confront and dismiss the enemy. Sato offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, a fleeting acknowledgement of the young private's commendable, if somewhat naive, confidence. "The enemy's capabilities, Kobayashi, remain inherently limited, particularly in this region. Their industrial capacity is still largely focused on the European theater, leaving them with insufficient resources for truly significant offensive operations in the Pacific. However, vigilance is a virtue. We must remain alert to any changes, no matter how subtle, in their communication patterns or their force dispositions. The integrity of our outer defensive perimeter, indeed the security of the entire co-prosperity sphere, depends on our ability to provide early and accurate warning." His words, while seemingly reassuring, held a subtle tension, an underlying current of official concern that even Sato himself couldn't entirely mask. As if summoned by the very invocation of vigilance, a sudden sharp burst of static erupted from Tanaka's receiver, jarring the quiet professionalism of the bunker. The sound was an electric rasp, an angry tearing through the calm. It was immediately followed by a fragmented voice transmission, the words swallowed and distorted by a wall of atmospheric interference. The urgency in the speaker's tone, however, pierced through the garble with undeniable clarity. Tanaka, his composure absolute, his movements economical, quickly adjusted the tuning controls, trying desperately to clarify the signal, to coax coherence from the chaos. "Many ships. Landing craft approaching from the southeast." The transmission dissolved back into a hissing static before Tanaka could capture more details, leaving behind only the ghost of a voice, a whisper of dread. He frowned, a deep furrow appearing between his brows, and swiftly checked his frequency logs, attempting to pinpoint the source of the anomalous signal. The coordinates, as best he could discern them through the noise, pointed unmistakably to the Guadalcanal area, but that made no sense. Guadalcanal was a Japanese outpost, a remote construction site. There were no scheduled Japanese operations of that magnitude in that sector. Kobayashi leaned forward, his youthful curiosity momentarily overcoming his ingrained discipline. "Equipment malfunction, Tanaka-san? Or perhaps a distant weather disturbance affecting the signal?" His tone suggested he was grasping for a less unsettling explanation. "Perhaps," Tanaka replied, his voice a low murmur, though his instincts, honed over decades of listening to the silent symphony of the airwaves, screamed otherwise. He had long ago learned to trust those subtle, almost intuitive warnings that only the most experienced operators developed. The peculiar texture of a signal, the unique cadence of a distant voice, the unspoken message embedded within the static itself. Something about this transmission, its distinct modulation, the specific background noise, the raw, desperate edge in the speaker's voice, triggered a deep, unsettling professional paranoia within him. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality beginning to fray. The next hour unfolded in a deceptive lull, a period of relative quietude punctuated only by the mundane, predictable rhythm of routine traffic between Japanese installations spread across the vast, sun-baked expanses of the Southwest Pacific. Weather reports, forecasting the usual oppressive heat and sudden tropical downpours, were exchanged. Requests for supplies, Fuel, ammunition, fresh water, pinged across the airwaves. Personnel transfers, the bureaucratic machinery of war grinding on, filled the gaps. It was the white noise of a functioning war machine, efficient, impersonal, and utterly oblivious to the nascent storm. Sato, ever the diligent officer, reviewed the overnight logs, his mind already anticipating the demands of the coming day. Kobayashi, his earlier concern temporarily abated, immersed himself in the focused task of practicing Morse code recognition, his determined taps on the practice key, a testament to his ambition to improve his already impressive skills. Then, at precisely 0647 hours, the fragile illusion of calm shattered, irrevocably and violently. Multiple frequencies, across the entire spectrum, erupted simultaneously. Overlapping transmissions, a cacophony of panicked voices surged through the airwaves, creating a sensory overload that sent Tanaka's hands flying across his control panel with the speed and precision of a seasoned combat veteran. His fingers, accustomed to the subtle nuances of the dials, worked with a frantic elegance, isolating individual channels, carving coherence from the overwhelming noise. His decades of experience allowed him to separate the chaotic jumble into distinct, terrifying conversations, each one a thread in a tapestry of unfolding disaster. What he heard, what he pieced together from the frantic, broken fragments, made his blood run cold, a chilling premonition of irreversible change. Tulagi under heavy bombardment, enemy warships in iron-bottom sound. A voice strained and hoarse fought against the roaring of distant artillery, the message barely audible yet undeniably clear. Request immediate air support. Marines landing on Red Beach. Overwhelming numbers. Another voice, young and desperate, conveyed a sense of utter futility, a plea that seemed destined to go unanswered. Communications center destroyed, falling back to secondary positions. Heavy casualties. The words dissolved into a sudden, piercing shriek of static, a digital death rattle. Tanaka's methodical nature, a bedrock of his professional persona, asserted itself over the rising tide of dread. His emotions, usually so meticulously guarded, were suppressed beneath layers of rigorous training and years of detached observation. He began logging each transmission with an almost obsessive precision, precise timestamps, specific frequency notations, identifying the garbled call signs. With every entry, a comprehensive, horrifying picture began to emerge. A coordinated, massive amphibious assault by Allied forces, targeting multiple Japanese positions across the southern Solomons. It was an offensive on a scale that dwarfed anything they had dared to imagine. Kobayashi, his young face pale and drawn in the amber glow of the vacuum tubes, stared at his own receiver in utter disbelief. His mind, accustomed to narratives of Japanese invincibility, struggled to reconcile the incoming data with his ingrained worldview. "Tanaka-san," he stammered, his voice laced with confusion and a nascent terror. "This cannot be accurate. This must be some kind of elaborate deception or a gross overestimation. The Americans lacked the capability for such an operation. Our intelligence reports, the official pronouncements, they all indicate, log everything." Tanaka interrupted, his voice cutting across the younger man's protestations, firm and unyielding despite the growing dread in his own chest. "Verify every call sign, cross-reference every reported position, maintain absolute objectivity. Our duty is to report what we hear, not what we wish to hear." His calm exterior, however, masked an internal maelstrom. He recognized the peculiar modulation of the incoming signals, the specific military phonetics, the rising frequency of unknown transmissions. He knew these weren't mere skirmishes or equipment malfunctions. This was something far more deliberate, far more devastating. Captain Sato, his face now a mask of growing alarm, materialized at their station. He had been drawn by the sudden, unprecedented surge in activity, the clamor of desperate voices that now filled the bunker. His untouched coffee cup sat forgotten on a nearby table, a silent testament to the abrupt interruption of his morning routine. As he listened to the raw, unfiltered stream of desperate communications flowing through their equipment, his color gradually drained, leaving his features stark and grim. The implications, once vague and theoretical, were now manifesting in brutal, undeniable clarity. "Sir," Tanaka reported, his eyes still fixed on the scrolling frequencies, his hands never ceasing their work. "We are receiving multiple distress calls, consistent and authenticated, from both Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Initial reports, supported by an overwhelming volume of transmissions, suggest a large-scale amphibious assault by American forces. The scale appears to be unprecedented for this theater." Sato's military training, deeply ingrained, warred fiercely with a profound, almost visceral disbelief. The official assessments, disseminated with unwavering certainty from higher headquarters, consistently portrayed the Americans as lacking the capacity, the resources, and indeed the will, to mount any significant offensive operations in the Pacific. Their industrial might, it was believed, remained largely focused on the distant European theater, leaving their Pacific fleet and army stretched thin, incapable of major strategic actions. Yet, the brutal, undeniable evidence crackling through their receivers painted a starkly, terrifyingly different picture. "Confirm the authenticity of these transmissions immediately," Sato ordered, though his voice, usually so resonant with authority, now possessed a brittle, almost pleading quality. "Verify every call sign, every authentication code. We cannot afford to relay inaccurate or exaggerated intelligence to Admiral Yamamoto's staff. Their decisions depend on absolute certainty." His words, a desperate clinging to protocol, echoed faintly in the increasingly chaotic bunker. As the morning progressed, stretching into an eternity, the true scope of the unfolding disaster became devastatingly apparent. Japanese units, scattered and isolated across the southern Solomons, reported being completely overwhelmed. Accounts spoke of staggering numbers of enemy forces, coordinated naval bombardments that pulverized defensive positions, and the systematic, relentless destruction of what were once considered impregnable strongholds. The communications, now a torrent of raw, unfiltered desperation, revealed a level of planning, resource commitment, and sheer aggressive intent that directly contradicted every previous assessment of American capabilities. Tanaka's logs, once neat and sparse, grew thicker with each passing hour, each entry a meticulous, agonizing documentation of the methodical collapse of Japan's painstakingly constructed outer defensive perimeter. He recognized the voices, radio operators he had monitored for months, young men like Kobayashi, filled with youthful fervor, who had shared in the widespread, almost arrogant belief in the Empire's invincibility. Now, their transmissions carried the unmistakable raw sounds of fear, panic, and an overwhelming, crushing desperation. The sheer volume of incoming calls, the growing frequency of broken signals, the heart-wrenching silence that followed each one, spoke volumes. "Estimate 3 enemy divisions? Repeat 3 divisions." A disembodied voice from Guadalcanal screamed, disbelief warring with the stark reality of the numbers. "Airfield overrun. Demolition charges set, but too late." Another voice, this one from Tulagi, choked with the smoke of burning fuel and exploding ammunition dumps. "Last transmission. Our position untenable. May the Emperor live 10,000 years." The final words were cut short by a burst of static, as sharp and final as a samurai's blade. Kobayashi, his face ashen, removed his headphones with shaking hands, the gesture almost ritualistic, a desperate attempt to sever the auditory link to the unfolding horror. He simply could not, would not listen any more to the systematic destruction of his countrymen, their desperate pleas transforming into final, defiant cries. The idealistic young man who had reported for duty that morning, brimming with a naive confidence in Japan's unassailable might, no longer existed. He had been irrevocably replaced by someone whose eyes had glimpsed the true, brutal face of modern warfare, someone whose ears had been privy to the raw, visceral sounds of defeat. His notebook lay open beside him, its pristine pages now filled with fragmentary, almost illegible reports that read like a grim obituary for Japanese supremacy in the Pacific. He struggled with a rising nausea, a profound, gut-wrenching shock at the chasm between the propaganda and the reality. How is this possible?" he whispered, his voice thin and reedy, more to himself than to his stoic colleagues. His words were punctuated by a deep, shuddering breath. "Our defenses were meant to be impregnable, meticulously planned, engineered to perfection. The Americans, we were told, were weak, their resolve fractured, their resources divided, perpetually focused on the European struggle. Every report, every broadcast, every official pronouncement reinforced this truth, yet what we hear defies all reason. Tanaka, a figure of grim composure, continued his methodical documentation, each precise entry a deliberate, almost mournful nail driven into the coffin of the Empire's Pacific ambitions. His years of experience, a grim tapestry woven from countless hours of silent listening, allowed him to read between the lines of the official communications, to understand the true, devastating meaning behind euphemistic phrases like tactical withdrawal or consolidating positions. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that these were not tactical maneuvers. The Japanese forces in the southern Solomons were not merely retreating, they were being systematically, ruthlessly destroyed by an enemy they had consistently, arrogantly, and perhaps fatally underestimated. A profound sadness, cold and deep, settled within him, a silent counterpoint to the controlled precision of his movements. Captain Sato, his imposing figure pacing endlessly behind their stations, found his usual military composure cracking under the sheer, unyielding weight of the intelligence they were gathering. He understood, with a clarity that was almost physically painful, the profound political implications of their reports. He saw, with chilling foresight, the career-ending consequences of delivering such unwelcome, indeed devastating news to superiors who had meticulously constructed their reputations, and indeed their entire worldview, on promises of continued, unbroken victory. Yet despite the gnawing fear for his own future, his duty to the Empire, a code ingrained deeper than any personal ambition, demanded absolute, unvarnished honesty. It was a brutal dilemma, a clash between self-preservation and an unyielding sense of honor. He stared at the growing pile of Tanaka's meticulously compiled logs, each page a testament to a truth that was rapidly becoming undeniable, and the implications for his career, but more terrifyingly, for the very fate of the Empire, became stark. The true moment of stark, unyielding clarity arrived at precisely 1134 hours. It wasn't a desperate cry, but a cold, clear, confident voice that pierced through the static. Tanaka, his senses heightened, intercepted a clear, almost pristine transmission from what was unmistakably an American command frequency. The English words, crisp, professional, devoid of any discernible panic, stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the chaotic, desperate Japanese communications they had been monitoring for hours. The sheer, almost arrogant calm of the enemy was itself a weapon. Henderson Field secured. Runway assessment in progress. Estimate operational capability within 72 hours. Repeat, 72 hours. The voice was detached, almost clinical, yet it resonated with an undeniable authority. The implications of this single, pivotal intercept hit Tanaka with the force of a physical blow, a sudden concussive realization that reverberated through the very core of his being. Henderson Field, the name of the airstrip on Guadalcanal, a remote, jungle-choked construction site that Japanese engineers had been meticulously building, intended to extend their strategic bomber range, threatening the distant shores of Australia and cutting vital Allied supply lines. Now, that very same airfield, a symbol of their expansion, was in enemy hands. In American hands, that carefully constructed airstrip would become a dagger, a razor-sharp point aimed directly at the heart of Japan's Pacific Empire, menacing Rabaul itself, disrupting supply lines, and creating an insurmountable springboard for future Allied assaults. It was the first significant breach in their impenetrable perimeter, one that could not be simply sealed or ignored. He translated the intercept for his colleagues, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, watching with grim fascination as understanding, stark and terrifying, dawned in their eyes. For Kobayashi, the words were a sudden, chilling revelation, shattering the last vestiges of his youthful idealism. For Sato, they were a confirmation of his deepest, unspoken fears, a validation of the grim reports his seasoned operator had been compiling. "They're not just taking Guadalcanal," Tanaka stated, his voice a low, almost mournful murmur, the words hanging heavy in the humid air of the bunker. "They're transforming it. They are turning it into a fortress, a base of operations, right on our doorstep." Sato stared at the translated intercept, his military mind honed by years of strategic planning, immediately grasping the devastating, irreversible implications. An American airbase, fully operational at Henderson Field, meant that Rabaul, their supposedly impregnable fortress, would become vulnerable to daily, relentless bombing attacks. This single development would disrupt the entire Japanese logistical network in the Southwest Pacific, severing vital supply routes and undermining their strategic superiority. The outer defensive perimeter, so meticulously constructed, so proudly proclaimed over the past 8 months, had not merely been breached, it had been decisively, fundamentally shattered. The full extent of the American commitment, their audacious objective, and the immediate, overwhelming success of their landing made it terrifyingly clear. This was not a mere raid. This was a major offensive, meticulously planned and executed, designed to irrevocably shift the balance of power in the Pacific. The tactical defeat was, in fact, a strategic catastrophe. The afternoon, usually a time of waning activity, brought a relentless, almost overwhelming stream of increasingly desperate communications from the remaining Japanese forces clinging to survival in the southern Solomons. Units reported being completely cut off from vital supply lines, surrounded by what they described as an overwhelming, relentless tide of enemy forces, and subjected to continuous pulverizing bombardment from unseen naval guns and relentless waves of aircraft. The coordinated, systematic nature of the assault became devastatingly apparent as Tanaka, with a grim determination, pieced together the fragments of the tactical picture from dozens of fragmentary, often broken reports. Each new piece of information, each faint signal, deepened the conviction that this was an enemy far more capable and determined than their high command had ever acknowledged. Kobayashi, his youthful energy completely sapped, had retreated into himself. He performed his duties mechanically, his movements stiff and devoid of his usual enthusiasm, his young face a mask of profound shock. He mechanically logged the transmissions, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before them. The idealism he had clung to, his unwavering faith in Japanese superiority, had been systematically shattered by the clinical efficiency of the American assault. The overwhelming, relentless firepower brought to bear against positions that were, by every official declaration, supposed to be impregnable. The brutal reality had pierced the carefully constructed veil of propaganda. "Tanaka-san," he managed, his voice a strained whisper, barely audible above the persistent static that now seemed to carry the very essence of despair. "What does this truly mean for the war? For us?" His gaze, once so full of bright, optimistic zeal, was now haunted, mirroring the deep, unsettling questions that had begun to plague Tanaka's own thoughts. The older sergeant paused in his methodical documentation, his pen hovering above the logbook, considering the question with a gravity it profoundly deserved. His years of experience, a grim tapestry woven from countless hours of silent listening, had instilled in him the ability to discern the broader implications of tactical intelligence, to understand how individual, isolated battles, however brutal, fit into the terrifying mosaic of the larger strategic picture. He understood that this was more than just a lost battle. It was a fundamental, irreversible shift in the strategic landscape of the Pacific. "It means, Kobayashi," Tanaka replied, his voice low and devoid of emotion, yet imbued with a profound, almost chilling certainty, that the Americans are no longer content to simply defend their scattered positions. They have made a decisive choice to attack, to seize the initiative, and more significantly, they possess the industrial capability and the unwavering will to sustain offensive operations on a scale we tragically failed to anticipate. This is not a temporary setback. This is a fundamental change in the very nature of this conflict. As evening descended, casting long, oppressive shadows that seemed to deepen the gloom within the bunker, the volume of communications from the southern Solomons began to diminish, not chillingly, because the fighting had ceased, but because the Japanese radio operators, clinging to their posts until the very last moment, were being systematically eliminated. The ensuing silence, deep and absolute, was infinitely more ominous than the earlier cacophony of desperate cries. It suggested not the end of a battle, but the complete, utter collapse of organized resistance, a void where life had once been. Tanaka's final log entry for August 7, 1942, written in his precise, almost surgical script, was stark in its brevity, yet devastating in its implications. All stations in Guadalcanal sector presumed overrun. No further communications expected. The words were a grim epitaph, a testament to a monumental loss. Captain Sato, his face now a mask of profound exhaustion and dawning horror, reviewed the accumulated intelligence. Each page, meticulously compiled by Tanaka, was a testament to a truth that shattered the comfortable illusions that had, for too long, guided Japanese strategic planning. The Americans had not merely proven capable, they had demonstrated capabilities that contradicted every confident assessment from Tokyo. They had launched a coordinated, overwhelming assault that had systematically dismantled and overrun supposedly impregnable defenses in a matter of hours, not days or weeks. The political implications were nothing short of staggering. Admiral Yamamoto's staff, the architects of imperial expansion, had assured the emperor with unwavering confidence that the outer defensive perimeter would hold for at least 2 years. This crucial buffer period, they had argued, would provide Japan with the necessary time to consolidate its recent territorial gains and, eventually, to negotiate a favorable, triumphant peace with a weary and defeated enemy. The swift, decisive loss of Guadalcanal and Tulagi, however, suggested that this carefully constructed timeline was not merely optimistic, but hopelessly, fatally, flawed. The narrative of inevitable victory had been ripped apart by the cold, hard facts of the battlefield, as relayed by the dying voices of their own men. "Sir," Tanaka interjected softly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence that had fallen over Sato, his eyes still fixed on the logbook, the record of their collective nightmare. The report? He understood the immense personal and professional cost of delivering such unpalatable truth. Sato nodded grimly, the weight of his decision pressing down on him, a physical burden. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his career, so carefully cultivated, so meticulously ascended, would likely end with the transmission of this precise, unvarnished intelligence. Yet his unwavering duty to the empire, a code of honor forged in the rigorous traditions of the imperial military, demanded absolute honesty, regardless of the personal consequences, however severe they might be. "Prepare a comprehensive summary, Tanaka," Sato ordered, his voice now imbued with a renewed, albeit somber authority. "Include every intercept, every tactical assessment, every strategic implication. Leave nothing out. High Command, regardless of what they wish to believe, must understand the true, unvarnished scope of this disaster. They must confront the reality that has unfolded today." As Tanaka, with meticulous, almost ritualistic care, began to compile their findings, the profound, almost unbearable weight of foresight settled over the radio station like a heavy, suffocating funeral shroud. They, the silent watchers of the airwaves, had been among the very first to understand the immense, devastating significance of August 7, 1942. They were the lonely prophets, the unheeded seers who had recognized with a chilling, irrefutable certainty that the tide of war, once flowing so majestically in Japan's favor, had now turned, irrevocably and violently, against them. The desperate, dying voices crackling through their receivers had carried far more than mere tactical intelligence. They had delivered the unmistakable, final death knell of the Pacific Empire. The last discernible transmission from Guadalcanal came at precisely 2147 hours. It was a brief, almost ghostly Morse code message, faint but distinct, that Tanaka decoded with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled machine. "Emperor Banzai, frequency going silent." The dots and dashes, a final act of defiance and loyalty, echoed in the stillness, a chilling farewell. In the sudden profound quiet that followed, a silence broken only by the persistent, unceasing hum of the generators and the distant rhythmic drumming of tropical rain against the bunker's concrete exterior, 3 men sat in a state of grim contemplation. They had borne witness to an empire's invincibility dying in real time, heard the once confident voices of their countrymen fade into static, then into utter, final silence. Their world, their understanding of the war, had been irrevocably altered. Kobayashi, stripped of his youthful exuberance and naive belief, stared blankly at his logs, the pages now crammed with fragmentary, harrowing reports that documented the systematic destruction of everything he had once believed about Japanese military supremacy. The young man who had begun the day filled with bright, unwavering confidence in ultimate victory now understood, with a terrible, crushing certainty, that the war had entered a new, terrifying phase. It was a phase not of conquest and glorious expansion, but of desperate, bloody attrition, a brutal struggle in which Japan would fight not for dominion, but for its very survival. The future, once a clear path to victory, was now a foggy, blood-soaked landscape. Tanaka, his face impassive, methodically filed his documentation, each page a testament to the unyielding professional competence that had allowed him to recognize the impending disaster long before his superiors. His decades of experience had prepared him for many things: the ebb and flow of intelligence, the deceit of enemy signals, the intricate dance of electronic warfare, but they had not prepared him for the profound, almost unbearable burden of being among the first to truly understand that the war, the glorious, inevitable war, was, in fact, irrevocably lost. The weight of that knowledge, cold and heavy, settled deep within his soul. Captain Sato, his features drawn and etched with the strain of the day's revelations, carefully sealed the intelligence summary in an envelope, its stark white surface emblazoned with the highest classification codes. He understood, with a clarity that offered no comfort, that its contents, however accurate, would trigger a catastrophic cascade of recriminations, desperate countermeasures, and a painful, agonizing reevaluation of Japan's entire strategic outlook. The comfortable certainties, the unshakable beliefs that had, until this fateful day, guided Japanese strategy, now lay in utter ruins. They had been replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of overwhelming American industrial and military capabilities, a force that had arrived with a sudden, devastating fury. Outside the bunker, the tropical night continued its ancient, indifferent rhythm, oblivious to the profound human drama unfolding within its concrete depths. The cicadas sang their nocturnal chorus, the geckos darted silently across the walls, and the pervasive humidity clung to everything like a second skin. But for the three men within, men who had listened to history turn on its very axis, August 7th, 1942, would forever remain seared into their memories. It was the day they heard the Pacific War's outcome decided, not by grand battles or heroic charges, but in the desperate, static-choked transmissions of failing radio waves, carrying the last dying whispers of an empire's hubris. The generators hummed on, their relentless thrum a symbol of unceasing vigilance, powering the sophisticated equipment that would continue to monitor the electromagnetic spectrum. But for the operators who now worked those frequencies, the nature of their mission had fundamentally shifted. They understood, with a profound and terrifying clarity, that they were no longer listening to the triumphant expansion of an empire, but to its slow, agonizing death throes. In the terrifying span of a single day, the confident, boastful voices of conquest had been brutally replaced by the mournful, chilling silence of defeat. And they, the unseen, unheard witnesses, had been among the very first to discern, to truly hear the devastating difference. As the night shift, their faces still unaware of the profound shift that had occurred, prepared to take over the stations, Tanaka made one final, private entry in his personal log, a notation that would never, under any circumstances, appear in official reports, but one that perfectly captured the bitter essence of what they had experienced. Today, we learned that wars are not won by faith alone, by spiritual fortitude or imperial decree, and that the unvarnished truth, however unwelcome, always arrives first through the unseen currents of radio waves, carried on the raw, desperate voices of the dying. The three men filed out of the bunker into the oppressive, starless tropical night, each burdened by the immense, isolating weight of knowledge that would prove both chillingly prescient and almost unbearable. They had borne witness to the precise moment when the Pacific War's outcome became, with terrifying certainty, inevitable. They had heard it in the static-filled pleas for help, pleas that would never be answered, prayers that would go unheard. They understood with a clarity that offered no comfort, that no amount of courage, no depth of loyalty, no degree of unwavering dedication could ultimately overcome the sheer industrial might now arrayed against their homeland. The future, once so clear in its victorious trajectory, had suddenly become a dark, uncharted, and perilous sea. In the brutal months that followed, as the Guadalcanal campaign devolved into the prolonged bloody meat grinder that Tanaka, with his grim foresight, had so accurately envisioned, their August 7th intelligence, their desperate, unheeded warnings, would be tragically, irrevocably vindicated by the relentless, brutal march of events. But on that humid, suffocating night in Rabaul, they were simply three men. Three ordinary men who had listened to an empire die, transmission by agonizing transmission, signal by fading signal, and understood, with a terrifying, singular clarity, that they had been irrevocably present at history's most pivotal, most devastating turning point. The radio waves, those invisible messengers of war, continued their ceaseless journey, carrying their immense burden of truth across the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific. But the men who had first painstakingly decoded that truth, the men who had heard the silent screams of a crumbling empire, would forever carry an even heavier burden. It was the chilling, indelible knowledge that they had heard the future, stark and unforgiving, in the desperate, dying voices of the past, and that the ultimate outcome of the war, the fate of an entire nation, had been decided, irrevocably and tragically, in the brief, fleeting moments it took for a radio signal to travel from the distant, blood-soaked shores of Guadalcanal to the silent, watchful bunker of Rabaul. If you found this untold story of August 7, 1942, as gripping as we did, please give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. What struck you most about these radio operators who heard history unfold in real time? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the hidden moments that shaped World War II. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices and pivotal moments to light. What other untold stories from the Pacific War would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments.